Ever notice how some constitutions are like, those dusty relics hidden away in a vault somewhere?
Yeah, totally.
Well, get ready for a wild ride, because India's is anything but. Today, we're taking a deep dive into how India's constitution has not just survived, but actually thrived for over 69 years.
Thrived. That's a good way to put it.
We're calling this deep dive Your Constitution. It's alive. Because, well, it really is.
It really is.
And we're pulling some fascinating insights from this textbook chapter we found. It's called Constitution as a Living Document.
Oh, I love that. A living document. It's remarkable how India's constitution acts as this living, breathing framework for the country. It's constantly evolving, meeting new challenges. It's not just some, static set of rules set in stone.
Right, like it has a pulse.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so different, right? Think about France, 5 different constitutions in just the last 2 centuries. It's a whole lot of change, a lot of upheaval. But India, still going strong since 1950.
That's incredible. And it really speaks to the incredible foresight of the folks who actually put the Constitution together. They understood that a country, just like society, needs a system that can adapt and change with the times.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole idea of a constitution that's both rock solid and adaptable. The textbook calls this rigid yet flexible. I don't know about you, but it kind of makes me think about those yogis who contort themselves into crazy poses.
You're not far off with that balancing act comparison. The magic of India's constitution is all about this really clever amendment process. Think of it like this. Some changes are small, like giving your living room a fresh coat of paint. But some amendments, those are major renovations, like adding an entirely new floor to your house.
So you're saying there are levels to these amendments depending on the scale of the change.
Exactly. Some, the more routine ones, just need a simple majority vote, like passing a regular law. Let's say, for example, they needed to adjust the retirement age for judges.
Yeah.
You wouldn't need a complete system overhaul for that.
Okay, so that's like a quick fix, right?
Yeah.
But what about those major renovations you mentioned, those big changes?
Now, for the big stuff, you're talking about needing a supermajority vote in Parliament, a much higher bar to clear. And to make sure no single part of the government has too much power, some of those amendments even need to be signed off by at least half of the states in India.
Wow, okay.
This really emphasizes that federal structure, that idea of distributed power.
That makes sense. It's about checks and balances.
Mhm.
But let's talk about the sheer number of amendments for a second, because the textbook mentions a whopping 103 amendments in 69 years. I mean, that just feels like a lot. Is that a sign of a healthy system, constantly being fine-tuned? Or is it a red flag that maybe the Constitution needs constant patching up?
That's a million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really easy to get caught up in that number, but here's the thing, the frequency of these amendments isn't totally random. You see these really fascinating patterns when you look at the timing of those amendments alongside India's political history.
Interesting. So it's not just about the numbers. There's a whole story hidden in those amendments. So what does that story tell us? Are we talking about political maneuvering here, or are these genuine reflections of a society that's growing and changing over time?
Well, the textbook breaks these amendments down into 3 main categories. First off, you've got your technical amendments, those small tweaks and clarifications, like fixing a typo in a recipe.
Important, but not exactly rewriting the cookbook.
Exactly. Then you've got amendments that are there to settle disagreements about what certain parts of the Constitution really mean. You see, sometimes Parliament and the judiciary might see things a little differently.
Right.
An amendment can help bring everyone back onto the same page.
So it's like they're both editors, making sure the final draft of the Constitution is crystal clear.
You got it. And lastly, there are those landmark amendments, the ones that reflect a much broader agreement. These are the big changes, often driven by shifts in values within society as a whole.
Okay, I like that big changes, landmark amendments. Give us an example, something our listeners can really connect with.
A perfect example would be the amendment that lowered the voting age in India from 21 to 18.
Right.
Now, that was huge. It completely changed how we view the role of young people in a democracy.
Now, that's what I call an amendment with impact. But let's not forget about those controversial amendments the textbook mentioned, specifically the ones that came about during the emergency period in India between 1970 and 1980.
Ah, yes. That period was a pressure cooker for constitutional change, for sure. The 42nd Amendment in particular really stands out.
What about it?
It was so sweeping, some scholars even saw it as almost rewriting the Constitution.
Whoa, a rewrite. Okay, what was it about that moment in India's history that led to such a dramatic change? And what were the long-term consequences of this for India's constitutional journey?
This is where things get really interesting. To really understand that 42nd Amendment, we need to talk about this landmark Supreme Court case that came right before it, the Kesavananda Bharati case of 1973. This case introduced this groundbreaking legal concept. It's called the Basic Structure Doctrine.
Okay, basic structure doctrine.
Isn't that kid?
Now you've got my attention. Tell me more. Wait, hold on. Are you saying this whole doctrine, this big legal principle, isn't even written directly in the Constitution?
Pretty much. It's like a legal secret handshake or something.
I like it.
The Basic Structure Doctrine basically puts limits on how much Parliament can actually change the Constitution, even with those amendments we were talking about.
Okay.
It's like, look, you can tinker around the edges, make some updates, but the core principles, those are off limits.
So it's like drawing a line in the sand. Remodel all you want, but don't even think about touching the foundation.
You got it. And here's the really interesting part. This doctrine didn't come about through some formal amendment process. It came from judicial interpretation, meaning the way the courts understand and apply the Constitution. It really shows you the power of the Indian judiciary. They can shape the meaning of the Constitution without actually changing the words on the page.
Wow. So the judiciary can redraw the lines, so to speak, without even picking up an eraser. That's some serious power. But this whole basic structure thing, how do we even know what falls under that? Is there like a list somewhere?
That's part of what makes it so fascinating. It's not like a checklist. It's a dynamic concept that's been debated and refined through all these different court judgments over time. But at its core, it's about the non-negotiables. We're talking about those rock-solid values that underpin the whole Indian Constitution. Democracy, federalism, secularism, separation of powers, the really big stuff.
Gotcha. So less about specific clauses, more about the spirit of the Constitution, what it truly stands for, protecting the intention, not just the letter of the law, right?
You nailed it. This approach is what lets the Constitution grow and adapt to new realities without losing sight of its core values. It's a delicate dance between honoring the original intent of the Constitution and making sure it stays relevant in a constantly changing world.
Right. Makes sense. It reminds me of like knowing the rules of a game versus understanding good sportsmanship. You need both for it to really work.
100%. And that's where we see this really interesting interplay between the judiciary, parliament, and the people. All of them have a crucial role in how the Constitution continues to evolve.
I see. Okay, so this whole living document thing is really starting to click for me. But with so many players involved, how does India keep that balance? How do they make sure the Constitution stays true to its roots while still reflecting how the nation is changing?
It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. It takes a lot of maturity and understanding from everyone involved, the judiciary, the parliament, and yes, even the people.
You're saying it's not just about like legal pronouncements from on high. It's about everyone understanding, having a shared constitutional ethos, right?
Right. It's about recognizing that a constitution isn't just some dusty old document. It's the living embodiment of a nation's values, its dreams, its identity. And it's up to everyone, all of us, to protect that.
So how does that actually work in a practical sense? What's there to make sure this whole balance doesn't go completely haywire?
Well, that's where the amendment process we talked about earlier comes in. Remember those special majorities and the states signing off? Those aren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They're crucial safeguards to make sure that any changes to the Constitution have broad support.
This is like a safety net to prevent one group from, hijacking the Constitution.
Exactly. It forces everyone to work together, to find common ground, to make sure the changes reflect what the people want, not just the folks in power.
Which brings me back to those graphs we talked about, the ones that showed how often amendments have popped up over time. If we look closer at those periods of like really intense constitutional change, what do they tell us about this whole balancing act between staying true to your roots and, embracing change?
It's a fascinating story for sure. Take the period from, say, 1970 to 1990 in India. Lots of amendments during that time. It was also a time of major political and social change, don't you think?
For sure. You had the emergency, those controversial amendments like the 42nd. It felt like the whole foundation of India's democracy was being tested.
And yet it held strong. Even in the face of those enormous challenges, the core values of the Constitution, things like democracy, fundamental rights, the rule of law, they all somehow managed to survive.
So even with all the back and forth, all the tension, the spirit of the Constitution prevailed.
It did. And I think that really speaks volumes about how resilient Indian democracy really is. The Constitution was built to evolve, to adapt, but those changes have to happen within the boundaries of its core values, its fundamental principles. Those are non-negotiables.
And that's where that basic structure doctrine comes back into play, right? It's like the ultimate safety net, the last line of defense, making sure that even if amendments are made, they don't mess with the soul of the Constitution.
Exactly. It's a pressure valve, letting off steam when needed, but never letting the whole system explode. A delicate balancing act, for sure.
So when we talk about the Indian Constitution as this living document, we're really talking about this constant conversation, this give and take between different parts of the government. It's about finding that balance between the actual words and the spirit behind them, between the past and the present. It's dynamic, not set in stone.
It is. It's about understanding that a constitution isn't some rigid set of rules. It's a living reflection of a nation's values, its dreams. And just like a nation, those values need to be able to change and adapt over time.
And that makes me think about something the textbook mentioned, how the success of any constitution is about more than just like legal interpretations and well-written amendments. It needs buy-in from the people and some maturity from the country's leaders.
Absolutely, because a constitution, no matter how well written, is just words on a page without the active participation of the people.
It's like any relationship. You need effort, compromise, and flexibility to keep it strong.
What a great analogy. It's about finding that sweet spot balancing individual needs with those shared values that hold us all together.
Now that's something to think about. But what does all this mean for the Indian Constitution going forward? What's next?
If we truly see the Constitution as a reflection of India's values, then its future depends on the choices India makes in the years to come.
So it's less about looking back and more about actively shaping the future, right? Writing that next chapter in the story of India's Constitution.
Exactly. And that's where you, our listener, come in.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Hit our listener with that thought-provoking question. What's the one thing you want them to really consider when it comes to the Indian Constitution and its future? All right, lay that thought-provoking question on us. What's the one thing you really want our listeners pondering when it comes to the Indian Constitution and its future?
Here it is, the question to chew on. If the Indian Constitution really is a living document reflecting, the nation's changing values, what amendments could it use in the years to come? And I don't just mean like official legal changes. I mean those shifts in how we understand it, how it's interpreted, those things that happen naturally over time.
Ooh, that's a good one. It's like we're handing the pen to our listeners, letting them be part of this conversation about India's constitutional journey.
Exactly. Because in the end, how vibrant a constitution is, it all comes down to each citizen, really being a part of it. It's not just some museum piece behind glass. It's a living, breathing thing, showing us the hopes, the dreams, even the disagreements of the people of India.
So, to everyone listening out there, what does the Indian Constitution mean to you? What role will you play in shaping where it goes from here?
Something to think about, right?
For sure. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into India's living constitution. Wow, I feel like we just scratched the surface.
Always more to uncover.
That's what makes it so interesting, right? It's a journey, not just a destination. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing, keep on exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep those conversations about the Constitution going strong.
Because a constitution, just like a democracy, needs everyone to be informed and engaged to really thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.